If we begin on time or even 1 minute earlier, it'll give us more time for discussion and questions. And we've had a very lively first symposium, and we have some excellent speakers. They're going to go in the order that they are listed. So it's Professor Jonathan Jong first from Oxford. And the theme of the second symposium is slightly broader. It's going to venture more into cultural issues and implications for broader questions such as religious freedom. Thank you.
It seems premature to me to speak of the implications of so young and uncertain a science as ours, for of all things religious freedom and cross-cultural understanding, as I cannot so much as utter the words religious freedom this close to this White House without wanting to throw up. I shall focus exclusively on the latter of the two concerns. What follows, in any case, are some reluctant hypotheses ripe for investigation rather than application. Doctoral students and funders, take note. My particular tribe, the so-called cognitive science of religion, is best known for ideas about the naturalness of religious ideas. The fact, if it is a fact, that the belief in gods is underpinned by psychological processes as universal as religion is ubiquitous. For years, we peddled theories about minimally counterintuitive agents and hypersensitive agency detection and mentalizing, and even collected some empirical evidence for our claims, though it must be said, not very much, and not very far beyond the convenient samples we pay lip service against. And our results have been somewhat disappointing. There is no clear evidential consensus on whether gods occupy a cognitive optimum for mnemonic purposes. There is no experimental evidence that agency detection leads to religious belief, though some correlational data suggest some kind of link. Studies correlating mentalizing abilities and religiosity provide inconsistent results. Even findings that survive meta-analysis, such as the experimental effects on religion as a promoter of prosocial and cooperative behavior, have been less successfully replicated outside the comforts of the West. So it was then, in the 1990s and the first few years of the new millennium. Much more recently, we have turned our scholarly attentions to what some are now calling evolved cultural learning mechanisms, a sort of Darwinized elaboration of what Alan Bandura would have simply recognized as social learning. All social learning involves models and learners, and not all models are created equal. In his classic studies in the early 1960s, Bandura found that children could learn to be aggressive toward a large rocking doll simply by watching models do so unpunished. But the social learning effect was stronger when the model was of the same sex as the child. The model matters, and not just for the transmission of behaviors. From the social psychological literature on persuasion, we know that source credibility is an important factor in persuasiveness, and that the credibility of the source is not merely dependent on their actual expertise. Rather, we attribute credibility to sources based on indirect cues like similarity, a la Bandura, group membership, social status or prestige, and tragically, for some of you, physical attractiveness. All of which is to say that we believe because we trust, but our trust is potentially easily exploited. There are charlatans aplenty ready to exploit us with their sophistry and demagoguery, or perhaps, given our source credibility biases, their chiseled jaws or leggy blondness. These, Joseph Henrich calls Machiavellian manipulators, the existence of whom generates an evolutionary problem. Henrich thus posits a sort of cultural immune system, a widespread habit that evolved to help us sort out teachers from tricksters. This immune system predisposes us to identify credibility-enhancing displays, creds, if you are as fond of acronyms as Henrich is. These are actions that are consistent with the beliefs espoused. To drop our academic airs for just a moment, we want our teachers to walk their talk. Furthermore, the more costly the walk, the more persuasive we find the talk. Thus, in a few inferential steps, masochistic rituals, and martyrdom. There are many ways to walk our talk. For example, as Elaine Wolster, Elliot Aronson, and Darcy Abrahams showed in their 1966 paper, a source is more persuasive when she's arguing for a position opposed to her own self-interest. Thus, the message itself can therefore be a costly signal of trustworthiness. Alternatively, a source can enhance his credibility by literally putting his money where his mouth is. Ayanna Willer, Joseph Henrik, and Aaron Naranzayan recently showed that people found a counterintuitive story more believable when they witnessed someone else bet money on the truth of the story. There have now also been attempts to measure the impact of religious creds in the real world. Jonathan Landman and Michael Burmester's two retrospective correlational studies on American participants found that childhood exposure to religious creds, including caregivers' religious observance and religiously motivated sacrificial behavior, was a better predictor of current belief in God than were caregivers' verbal emphases on religion, or even the participants' own childhood religious observances. Similarly, Willard and Single found that exposure to creds explained much of the difference in religious belief and participation between two historically and culturally comparable but religiously divergent countries, the societally secular Czech Republic and the unrepentantly Catholic Slovakia. There is little here that should lead us to be optimistic about cross-cultural or interreligious rapprochement. In a section partially subheaded, quote, "Why people do not believe in other people's gods," end quote, Henrik observes that from the perspective of a learner, the difference between Yahweh and Zeus is that the learners observe members of their social group performing creds. The implication is that creds are effective within social groups rather than across them. But perhaps Henrik's pessimism is premature. He supposes that costly religious signals, suicide bombing, clerical celibacy, ritualistic self-mutilation, are mainly directed to those who are already within the fold, to fire up the lukewarm, if you will. But then he also seems to take Justin Martyr's autobiographical narrative for granted, that Justin converted to Christianity after witnessing for himself the torture and death of other earlier Christian martyrs. Time for the first reluctant hypothesis, then. We need models of interfaith dialogue, but not just any models will do. They should, of course, be high-status individuals who are uncontroversially members of the various in-groups in question, and also good-looking. But more than that, interfaith dialogue and cooperation has to be seen as a costly endeavor for the individuals and institutions concerned. Now, this probably seems obvious here in Washington, D.C., where it is at least the received wisdom that to successfully reach across party lines, you need prominent Republican and Democrats to be seen working together. What is less clear is whether there is any costly cooperation going on. Just for kicks, I looked at the statistics for bill co-sponsorship a few days ago. I sorted the House of Representatives by the proportion of their co-sponsored bills that originated from the opposing party. On the top, 69.1% of Democrat Colin Peterson's co-sponsored bills were introduced by a Republican. In contrast, 0.8% of Republican Jeb Hensarling's co-sponsored bills were introduced by a Democrat. Just looking at the top and bottom 10, two observations may be made. First, 100% of the top 10 most bipartisan representatives were Democrats. All but one of the least bipartisan representatives were Republicans. Make of that what you will. The second observation is that most bipartisan representatives were by no means those in safe seats. They won, on average, with 58% of the vote. In contrast, the least bipartisan representatives won with 70% of the vote. The difference, for what it's worth, which is not much, is statistically significant. Admittedly, it is difficult to know if this can count as evidence for costly cooperation. This depends on whether other members of Congress, the targets of persuasion, perceive it as such. Experiments by Laurel Harbridge have shown that voters might say they want more bipartisan cooperation, but this abstract preference is very often outweighed by their own partisan considerations on specific issues. Lobbyists I've spoken to are well aware of this, and insofar as politicians are also clued in on this bit of political psychology, then bipartisan cooperation is in fact costly. And yet, Those in safe seats are, at least in my silly little pilot study, more reluctant to engage than their more precarious colleagues. I have already alluded to the place of rituals in all of this, particularly those that Dimitri Tsakalatas terms extreme and Harvey Whitehouse terms dysphoric. Most of the research on this has focused on effects within groups or among strangers rather than across pre-existing groups. In their study among Mauritian Hindus, Tsakalatas and colleagues found that participation in a ritual involving self-mutilation led to increased donations to a local temple relative to a ritual involving collective singing and prayer. Similarly, in a lab with much tamer manipulations, Brock Bastian and colleagues found that sharing painful experiences, sticking one's hands into an ice bucket, doing a wall squat, eating hot chilies, led to increased feelings of social bondedness and cooperative behavior in an economic game. Now, most of these studies focus on cooperation and commitment to, or desire to affiliate. They're not about the transmission of beliefs as such, though a social psychologist would want to assert that the membrane between believing and belonging is permeable. There are, therefore, some obvious studies waiting to be done here. We don't yet know whether co-participation in dysphoric rituals can bind out-groups together in the way that they seem to strengthen bonds within groups and among strangers. Classic social psychological studies, like Sharif's famous rubber cave studies in the 1950s, suggest that they might, but the hypothesis requires testing. We don't yet know whether increased social bonding or decreased hostility, as the case may be, facilitates better intergroup understanding, but this too can be measured insofar as it can be operationalized. We now move away from obviously costly rituals into the relatively mundane and widespread phenomenon of synchronous rituals, drumming, marching, and so forth. The literature on the role of behavioral synchrony in social bonding has been growing rapidly for nearly a decade now. Study after study has shown that synchrony increases cooperation, compassion, helpfulness, liking, and other forms of prosociality among co-performers, both adults and children. As with the research on extreme or dysphoric rituals, the work on synchrony has mainly focused on prosociality within groups, typically among co-performers of the synchronous activity itself. However, my colleague Paul Reddish has found evidence of a generalized effect of synchrony, in which co-performers are more willing to help a stranger, not among the performers themselves. In their second study of that paper, they also found an effect of synchrony across group boundaries. They divided participants into two groups and had them perform a task within each group. At the end of the task, participants were asked to allocate money between the two groups. Groups that performed the synchronous task were more generous to the outgroup than those that performed a non-synchronous cooperative task, which is completing a puzzle together, classic minimal group paradigm. More recently, we compared the effects of synchrony on behavior toward a real-life out-group member, someone from a rival university in the same town, relative to an in-group member from the participant's own university. Consistent with previous research, we found that synchrony boosted helping behavior, but crucially, it did so regardless of whether the target was an in-group or an out-group member. Finally, my colleagues at Oxford, Bahar Tungcheng and Emma Cohen, have also looked at what happens when two groups perform synchronous actions with each other. They divided small groups of children, age 9 or so, into an orange and a green group, again, the minimal group paradigm, and encouraged them to identify with their teams by letting them wear colored vests and creating a group flag. They were then taught to move to a beat played via headphones, silent disco style. After this, the two groups of children faced each other and either moved synchronously or asynchronously, depending on what was playing through their headphones. Then, the children answered questions about how they felt about their own group and other group members, and also played a game that involved either moving toward or away from the group. They found, you will not be surprised to hear now, that groups that were made to move in synchrony were more favorably disposed to each other and wanted to have closer physical proximity with one another. So, intergroup synchrony might provide a way in. On that note, my own team working on the Cognitive and Cultural Foundations of Morality and Religion project is continuing this work on the intergroup effects of synchrony, particularly on whether it can facilitate religious and moral dialogue across group boundaries. With no reluctance, then, we hypothesize that co-participation in synchronous rituals can foster interreligious and moral agreement, and perhaps equally importantly, at least feelings of mutual understanding. To end then, in summary, when we talk about cognition and belief, we have a tendency to focus on what happens above our necks. Such is the understandable bias of academicians, I suppose. But believing is an embodied phenomenon, as are all human phenomena. We believe because we watch others as they behave in their belief, and because we too behave in those ways, perhaps even unthinkingly at first. Even our belonging is moved by the movements of our bodies together in our singing and dancing, our clapping and cheering, our kneeling and sitting and standing and crossing ourselves together. Whether we like it or not, it is neither syllogisms nor scatterplots that bring minds together, after all. Attempts to foster understanding and cooperation across boundaries of any kind, religious, political, or otherwise, ignore this fact at their peril. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for one or two questions. Yes, please.
Yeah, I have more sort of a comment. So the study that you mentioned by Xigalatas with rising ritual costs and donation. So one of the... Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. So one of the surprising outcomes was actually that the rising ritual costs were also correlated with feeling more Mauritian rather than Hindu, which I think, as you suggested, you know, with extreme rituals or rituals in general, it can go both ways. So they can promote intergroup hostility, but in the context of Mauritius, which is a very religiously tolerant country, and they invest a lot in promoting what they call unity in diversity. One of the outcomes was that really the people felt more united after going through the ordeal. And there was particularly this ritual, you had peoples of various faiths taking part, so you have Christians, sometimes even Muslims. So,
excellent. Yeah.
Thank you. Other questions? Oh, yes, please.
So I was wondering if you felt at all whether there would be an impact currently and maybe depending on what happens in the future of the World Wide Web, the internet, and people's access to the internet and observing different beliefs in action or opinions, and whether that would change any of your conclusions.
I'm torn about this. In the previous session, we talked about how pluralism has a sort of secularizing effect. And the idea being, we may have been brought up in a particular tradition, but the exposure to other traditions means that we sort of doubt our own traditions, right? There's very little evidence that polarization on the web is any less than polarization in real life. So I think if there is a difference between these two cases, which is to say pluralized societies and a pluralized internet, it is that pluralized societies involve humans with bodies, and the internet just is, text on a page. And so it's much easier to ignore bits of the web that we don't like, whereas it's much more difficult to ignore typo-sound rituals in your backyard, hearing the azan at 5 o'clock in the morning, and hearing about your friends going to church, which is the way it was where I grew up in Malaysia, right? It was massively ethnically diverse. It doesn't really have a secularizing force in Malaysia, but I think for a long time, we don't have the kinds of fundamentalisms in Malaysia until maybe quite recently, partly I think because of the pluralism.
Yes, if I might add something to that, the internet hasn't actually expanded our interactions. We interact with others through echo chambers, and we typically look for others who agree with us and endorse our own views and interact with them within those echo chambers. So that's another thing to keep in mind. I think we should move on now to the second speaker. Thank you very much. And it's Dr. Kelly Clark from Grand Valley State University.
Thanks for the warm applause. Neil got one. But Will had to beg for his, so I see how it goes. So my topic is going to be on religion and violence, and I think there are a lot of myths about religion and violence, and I think the cognitive psychology of religion can really help us understand what some of the myths are and what really motivates violence, and then also help us to look for some solutions with respect to religion and violence. And I think the topic is as pressing as we can imagine in our world today, from San Bernardino to Manchester to Pakistan to Baghdad. We see everywhere people attributing their own violence to religion, but also those of us on the outside looking in attribute violence to religion. And I think we need to come to a better scientific understanding of what's going on before we can figure out how to respond. There's one, I think, perfectly natural and obvious response. So my topic is dangerously uninformed. I'm going to look at the uninformed part of this, and Richard Dawkins is going to be my case study initially for the uninformed. And the claim, I think, is that religion is really the root of evil. It's the claim that Dawkins made in his book, The God Delusion. It's a claim that's widely made by lots of people. Christopher Hitchens, in one of his books, says religion poisons everything. And he goes on in that book to blame religion on basically every evil in the history of the world. And in the past 100 years, mainly Islam is at fault. And Dawkins, it's in a documentary that he produced, and the subtitle was Religion, the Root of All Evil. That was a question mark. But when you watched the film, you knew that the answer was yes, religion is the root of all evil. And I think the assumption on the part of many people is if we can just get rid of religion, then we'll get rid of evil in the world. I think that's deeply mistaken. I think it's uninformed, and when I get to the end, I want to argue that it's dangerously uninformed. So I think what motivates a lot of violence in the world are threats to ourself, which I'm not going to look at. If we feel like someone is after our life or our livelihood or our food, if someone comes after ourself, then we respond with fight or flight. I think that's the primary motivation to at least self-defensive violence. And I think if people come after our kin, I know if I see my son about to go in front of a car, I might even risk my life to save my son. So threats to kin, we know that we'll respond fight or flight with threats to kin. I want to look here at threats to our tribe. We know that in early human groups that conflict drove cooperation, that conflict brought groups together beyond kin groups into more tribal groups, and those tribal groups were able to work together for some cooperative benefits like specialization of labor, shared child rearing, group hunters are more successful, there's increased genetic diversity in these groups, you get stronger armies, and there's shared learning. So there are, even though all of us are in competition with one another, you find out in studies of early human deaths that not only are there deaths between tribes, but even within tribes, people who are friends, so to speak, tend to kill each other, and you even find that kin kill kin. So we are competitors, and we're in competition with one another, but competition drove us into groups, and there were group advantages, and those group advantages, by and large, were worth the costs that they had. But if they're threats to our tribe, and this gets back to many things that other people are saying, if they're threats to our tribe, then our natural instinct is fight or flight. Our very lives and livelihoods are intimately hooked up with members of our tribe, and so if there are threats to them, then we'll be inclined to fight. And so whatever constitutes in-group, and here I mean not just kin groups, but our tribal groups, in-group becomes for us good, food, sorry, that should be good, not food, although it is food too, so what the heck, food, friend, it's got a nice alliteration, food, friend, evil enemy, you see that? So we'll go with food on this. But in-group creates out-group. And I think we're pretty deeply and instinctively biased towards making really quick and hasty in-group, out-group judgments. Because out on the Serengeti, if you couldn't figure out pretty quickly who was in your group, your genes were probably removed from the gene pool, or at least likely removed from the gene pool. And so cultural adaptations generated differences, some people call them tribal markers between social groups, that allowed us easily to tell who's in and easily to tell who's out. So some of them are obvious. You might wear different clothes to tell who's in and to tell who's out, or tattoos or paints. People that work in this area say even smells are something that we can tell. We're really good at distinguishing smells. And so I know my first trip to China, when I went there, well, let me tell you about this Chinese guy that came one time to my house. He flew over from China, so he'd been in a plane for a long time and hadn't bathed for a long time. Maybe hadn't bathed even before he got there. Anyway, he arrived, and I don't really smell my peeps, people in my tribe, but I smelled him, and he didn't just smell, he stank. People who are like us smell, people who aren't like us stink. Well, just to switch it a little bit, we had a Chinese student who lived with us for a while, and one time we were gone for a week at Christmas, and we came home, and the whole house fan was on. I live in Michigan. It was about 0 degrees. We have this big, massive whole house fan that sucks all the air through your windows and out. We use it in the summer to cool the house down quickly. He had it on in January because he said our house stunk. People who are like us smell, people who aren't like us stink. And we use that to make really quick judgments about who's in group and who's out group. And even accents play a role. We're good at detecting accents. I think it's probably one of the reasons why we laugh at in-group, out-group names. We think Mohammed bin blah, 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 and then someone laughs at it on national television. It's like they're out. Those are out people, and we're in people. And we need to know this right away, because out-group was a potential enemy, in-group was, by and large, friend. Religion, I think, is a tribal marker. It tells us who's in our group, and all this talk about costly signaling and rituals, and it's a way for us to know who's in our group, and who's in our group is someone we can trust, they're good, and they're friend, they're fellow cooperators, they're not enemy. It's a tribal marker that helps us with our devotion to self, kin, and tribe. And threats to those things, conflicts arise, I think, over threats to self. Primarily, conflicts arise over threats to self, kin, and tribe, so threats to land, food, water, autonomy, honor, and shame. I won't develop that here, but I think they're related to all of those things. Primarily, conflicts arise over these things, not over religion. So religion, I think, is a recruiting tool, and it can be a force multiplier. It can get people to do things they might not otherwise have done, but it's low on the structure of motivation. So I'll just give a quick example. Take Iran, for example. Ireland, for example. It was Protestant Catholic. We know that was the division of the groups there. But they weren't fighting over the doctrine of transubstantiation or justification by grace alone. Protestant Catholic were just tribal markers. We could go on for this, but we all think with ISIS that religion is the thing that uniquely defines the conflict. And that commits, I think, when we attribute the violence to the religion and not to something underlying, we're committing the fundamental attribution error. We're focusing on an internal factor such as a personality trait, but we ignore or minimize external situational factors. So if I'm late, I attribute my tardiness to an important phone call or the traffic was bad or something like that. But if you're late, you're irresponsible, you don't care about other people. I attribute to a character defect on your part. So when Arab and Muslims commit an act of violence, we instantly believe that it was because they're Arabs or Muslims, all the while ignoring any possible or even likely contributing causes. I'll just quickly go over this with Mohamed Atta, the person in charge of the 9/11 attacks on the U.S. He wrote this. So remember, God, as he said in our book, our Lord, O Lord, pour out your patience upon us and make our feet steadfast and give us victory over the infidels. And his words, and the only thing they said, Lord, forgive our sins and excesses and make our feet steadfast and give us victory over the infidels. And it goes on and on and on. So we might think that when we read what he says, that we know the reason he did it was because he was a Muslim and Muslims are violent. We might think that, but we also know this about Mohamed Atta. He seldom attended mosques. He drank heavily. He drank every night, almost every night, partied late into the night. He snorted cocaine, and when his stripper girlfriend broke up with him, he beheaded her cat and kittens and disemboweled them and distributed all the parts all over her house so that she would find them later like his presents after she died to remember him, and he ate pork. Now, you might think that's not really a good Muslim. And if you do, then you might think even him telling us why he did it is more an instance of reputation management than it is, or self-deceit, than it is a profession of motivation. So people that work in this area, I think I'll just read one person. This is from England's MI5 Behavioral Science Unit. People that work in this find that religion is not a motivator or not a primary motivator for radicalization. This was a secret report that was revealed. Says, far from being religious zealots, a large number of those involved in terrorism do not practice their faith regularly. Many lack religious literacy and are religious novices. And Lydia Wilson and Scott Atran and Harvey Whitehouse have reached similar conclusions in face-to-face encounters with people who have radicalized. Lydia Wilson notes that 2 young men who radicalized in England and were headed to Syria were stopped at the airport, and in their bags they found the book Quran for Dummies. So I think it's uninformed to think that religion is the primary motivator of so-called religious violence. I think that's the uninformed part. Here's why I think it's dangerous. ISIS recruits by increasing Islamophobia in the West. And you can read this, I'm not making this up. You can read ISIS's game plan. The Management of Savagery is the name of their game plan. It was written about 2006 or 2007, and you can read exactly what their game plan is. This is why they take credit for every instance of violence done by a Muslim or an Arab in the world. They want to increase Islamophobia in the West, and so they employ people to do terror attacks to help Muslims see that non-Muslims hate Islam. That's what they want to see. And they want non-Muslims to harm Muslims. That's what they want. That's the response that they want to these activities. And honestly, you don't need very many of them. It's easy to exaggerate how much violence there is in the world because of terrorism, or at least in the US. There is a lot in the world, but it's mostly like in Syria, and it's mostly Muslim to Muslim. And again, I think in those cases, it's not over religion. It's over some other more fundamental factors. So and this is what they say in their report, their game plan. If moderate Muslims feel alienated and unsafe, they'll be forced out of the gray zone and then into the light. That's the plan. So we play into their plan if we think it's because of their religion and we respond to the religion. So by tarring Islam with the extremist brush, we perpetuate the myth that Islam is violent and that Muslims are violent. And then we're on to Islamophobia, and ISIS wins. So that's about them. Here's the other part about, and then our responses about why it's dangerously misinformed. Attributing extremism to religion and ignoring external conditions makes extremism their problem. So they're entirely responsible, and they need to change. So it's about Muslims, and I'm sorry to just talk about Muslims, but this is where the rubber meets the road these days, I'm afraid. It's about Muslims and Arabs. It's about them, and primitives and barbarians, and I could go on and on. It's about them, and they need to change, and we can just sit over here and go on doing the things that we're doing in the world. But if extremism is motivated by external conditions, then those who created those conditions are also responsible. And this is a quotation from some guy whose notes I can't read. We cannot even begin to prevent violence until we can acknowledge that we ourselves are doing what contributes to it actively or passively. And I think we're contributors. I think we in the US have created the external conditions that have created the conditions for violence. I'll just mention Iraq. I could go through a long list. I think it's shameful that we went to Saudi Arabia and struck a deal with them. I think they're the #1 exporter of radicalism in the world. And we've made a pact with Saudi Arabia because we got cheap oil and we got to sell our weapons to Saudi Arabia, and we allowed them to export Wahhabism around the world. That's the intellectual force behind terrorists. But let's just take Iraq. I think 2,400 people were killed in the 9/11 attacks. At least 250,000 innocent people were killed when we attacked Iraq. All of the bombers were from Saudi Arabia. We attacked the wrong country. We attacked Iraq. So we hit the wrong country. We killed minimum, and I think these figures are not right, we killed minimum 250,000 people, innocent people, minimum. Physicians for social responsibility, many of them Nobel Prize winning physicians, have tried to come up with their own estimates, and they think that 1.5 to 2 million people were killed through our Iraqi invasion. Some, for example, children were killed because we ruined the water supply, and infant mortality rate shot up. So you can't just say what happened in the 30 days of the war. You have to look at the long-term effects of us destabilizing a country, but also totally destroying its infrastructure. They think 1.5 to 2 million people were killed, 80% of them innocent, half of them children. We also created a power vacuum in which ISIS was allowed to rise to power. Honestly, this pisses people off. It creates conditions for violence. It's not all about them. It's also about us. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for a couple of questions. I'm going to play devil's advocate and just ask the first question. When we look at research on voting, we find that those people who vote, around 50% of eligible people vote in the United States. When we look at the people who vote, a lot of them are completely ignorant of the policies of the Democrats and Republicans. They're ignorant of the policies of the particular people they have voted for. And we ask them, did you vote Republican or Democrat? They say, oh, I'm a Democrat or Republican. We don't then question, okay, this is not really a Democrat because it's an ignorant voter. Why should we question somebody who says, I threw the bomb because I am such and such a religious person? Even though that person is ignorant of the religion, they say, I am from that religion. So why should we question it?
Can you put that time's up thing? So I think in general, most of us aren't that in touch with our own motivations. We think we are, and we think we've got it all figured out. And I think most of us, most of the time, think that, like, I'm going to do it in the first person. I think that I'm like a rational calculator who's taken in the evidence and acquired the beliefs. And if somebody disagrees with me, I tend to think they're irrational and immoral and probably even crazy. And so it's easy to think that about suicide bombers. I think they're not irrational. I don't even think they're immoral. There's a way in which it fits in with what they think is good. And, but I also think I'm not that in touch with what motivates me, and so I suspect they're not that in touch with it either. But I do want to say this. I don't think that religion is never a motivator, and it doesn't factor into the structure of motivations. I think it's not a primary motivator. The kid who bombed Manchester was from Libya, and just so you know, I'm an equal opportunity critic. Obama listening to Hillary helped get Gaddafi out of Libya. That country is totally destabilized. It's a bunch of warring tribes. It's awful there, and we created those conditions. Now, and then he went and lived there for a while. Were those those external circumstances non-factors or not? My suspicions are those are probably primary motivators. But again, I don't say religion is not a motivator. I just think it's not the primary motivator, and we tend to forget that.
Sir, we have a question. Yeah.
Yeah, to follow up on that. It is an interesting point when you move past the new atheism stance that religion causes violence, which doesn't have any empirical evidence behind it. And of course, Jeremy Ginger's group and many others have shown that it doesn't cause violence. When you think from God's perspective, you're actually less inclined to be violent.
Can I add one quick point to this? They found that people that go to Muslims who are regular attenders at mosques are less likely to radicalize. And then there are these other studies that sort of thinking God things make people less likely to be violent.
So you dismiss the causal point, but you're left with the correlation that at least today, a lot of intergroup violence, it divides along religious lines internationally. And so from your data, why is there the correlation?
Why is there that correlation?
Yeah. Is it a historical artifact? Or is there something, is it geopolitical? Is it a byproduct, or is there something?
Well, I'd have to go through them case by case, but I had 20 minutes, so I did my 20-minute thing. But I'll say, by and large, these are geopolitical issues that what we found out in Libya, for example, was there were all these tribal groups, and when the big wicked despot who actually kept the tribal groups in control left, all the tribal groups tried to reassert themselves. And we found the same thing when the Soviet Union stopped. We found when the Soviet Union stopped exercising control and tribal groups came up, they started warring with one another. And I think it's mostly geopolitical. It's not, I don't think religion plays much of a role whatsoever in it.
I was going to add to that. So, I mean, so if it's geopolitical, you might think, right, you might be tempted to think that a better way to leverage people to do horrible things is to deploy the concept of one's nation state, right? So if something terrible happens in Iraq, you get Iraqis to do terrible things, something like this, right? But of course, there are just a lot more people in one's religious and also ethnic group than there are people in your nation state. And so just because you have much larger numbers in a superordinate category, like that's a much more useful concept to deploy. But of course, for decades now, social psychologists have been saying, how we get people to cooperate, right? We generate a superordinate category that captures all our smaller tribal instincts. So like all these good things that, at least from a social psychological perspective, the thing that we thought was a good thing, the generation of a superordinate category, turns out to be a double-edged sword. So it's not religion per se, I think that it's superordinateness.
I think that's a beautiful perspective, and I think in this research, we know a lot now about tribalism and about the lack of causality with religion and conflict, but now is the time to actually isolate these other variables and try to understand the mechanisms behind this, and I think there's a big research gap there.
Yeah, no, agreed.
Yes, excellent. Could we please move on, and then we'll come back to questions after the final speaker, who is Dr. Fern Elson-Baker. Thank you. From Newman University.
Oh, now they clap.
So I don't even have to ask for applause. Great, fantastic. So, I'm going to read because I'm a bit jet lagged, so do stop me if you think I'm speaking too quickly. Having worked on cultural interfaith dialogue programs across a range of countries, I'm aware that it's an accepted and evidence norm that finding common ground whilst recognising fundamental differences between groups and individuals is an integral facet of building trust between groups or individuals. Whilst it's the case that cognition of belief research might contribute to bringing down these barriers, as Adam was highlighting earlier this morning, between different groups or believers across cultures, as a philosopher of science, I wanted to take a step back from this to examine what might be some of the pitfalls in undertaking this kind of cross-cultural research and examine some of the ways in which our own cultures may impact on the research design and dissemination across any cross-cultural research project. In particular, I want to draw upon some of the accepted concepts that underpin more qualitative or discourse-based research and highlight how these concepts are equally important when considering or starting to engage in any kind of form of cross-cultural study, including those studies that we might think of in less subjective areas or within a kind of more objective domain of research, for example, quantitative research. So I'm just going to cover a few top issues here. So this is kind of like philosophy of science 101. So I can talk a bit about fact-value distinctions, issues framing in research, and then how we might move beyond these kind of epistemic frames. I will explain what all of these things as I move through. I recognise this is a multidisciplinary room, and therefore some of you might not be cognizant of these issues. One of the things that I really want to draw out is how we might think about our research culture as one of the primary stumbling blocks in terms of designing cross-cultural research studies. Now, normally, most often concerns that come to light when we're thinking about cross-cultural research is cultural differences in terms of geographies, geopolitics or political systems, localized cultural norms, distinct communities or group practices, and the fundamental one, which is problematic in survey research, which is translation issues. And these are all very important aspects of this kind of research. However, today I want to focus on our research culture in a way that doesn't often get talked about. And what I'm thinking of when I'm talking about research culture is the kind of system of knowledge production to which we all contribute, but we are also simultaneously consumers of. And by this, I mean the kind of scientific or empirical research cultures which we are all trained in, the hegemonic processes that are inherent within our education and scholarly systems. So just to draw on a quote from Ali's work, I'm thinking about how research methods are not only intimately interwoven with cultural practices, but are indeed themselves cultural practices. However, I'm also not just interested in the cultural differences between disciplines, but also in the way in which Western research, which Miguel was highlighting earlier, can act as a culture of which psychology and social science disciplines are themselves subcultures. So in essence, what I'm asking you to do, to draw on Miguel's analogy, is to switch off your torch. In terms of debates surrounding religious freedom, it is important to recognise that science itself can act as a form of cultural identity, beyond just that of being a researcher or a practitioner. To give an example from the UK, this is, I've just got some headlines from newspaper cuttings, and this is really an example where I just want to highlight how science can act as an identity as part of the wider kind of culture wars in terms of the styles of debate that we're talking about in terms of pushing notions of Islamophobia, for example. So we have to be wary of how science can be used as a kind of proxy identity within different geopolitical agendas. Now, this is a newspaper article based on an interview with a geneticist at UCL called Steve Jones. To be fair to Steve, he did not say this in such an explicit way, but he was talking about how Muslim students were walking out of his lectures on evolution because they felt it clashed with the Quran. He did later corroborate this by saying that Christian students were walking out as well, but unfortunately, it was too late because it gets picked up by other organisations or groups that have very different geopolitical agendas or aims to people who may be thinking about communicating science. So this is a website called Jihad Watch. This one's lovely. You might not be able to read this. Islam versus Europe, where Islam spreads, freedom dies. So we have to be really, really careful about the way that we're packaging what we might think of as kind of factual statements about science, science education, or scientific research in science communication. It's important to recognise that science and by proxy social scientific research and practice can act as a cultural identity in this context, and importantly, when we're working across global geographies, it's not possible to disentangle this from public narratives surrounding secularisation or the clash of civilisations. So basically the idea is that religious belief is in the decline and is being trumped by science, or that there is an inevitable clash between Western worldviews and, in this instance, Muslim majority cultures. This process is also evident within aspects of the way that social science research is framed. And what I want to kind of talk a bit about today is less about the kind of notion of Islamophobia, though I'm happy to talk about that in discussion, but more about the kind of epistemological assumptions that we might make from the outset when designing research. there is little analysis of the kind of ways in which the roles of fact and value kind of play out in terms of the kind of research that we undertake in these fields, or indeed the secular position of the academy that we are working within. So today I just want to briefly examine the impact of epistemological preconceptions in language usage and issues framing, and how this might impact on the research that we're designing, the results, and the way that we're disseminating it, particularly in relation to the relationship between science, rationality, reason, and belief. So before I start, I just want to go through and talk a little bit about what I mean by fact and value. So what I really want to do is kind of unpick how evaluative or normative language can be distinguished, if at all, from factual or descriptive language in the study of scientific study of religion. My principal concern here when addressing this subject is to argue that we need to adopt a more moderate or reflexive methodological approach that allows us to do two things. Firstly, to better understand the epistemic or contextual values in which we are constructing the social scientific research that we're undertaking, and to better critically engage with our own and others' epistemic or cultural investment in our research. So just to quickly zip through what I mean by evaluative language and fact-value distinctions, I just want to use an example from the work of John Dupre, who is a well-known philosopher of biology. So Dupre asks us to consider, I quote, "Insofar as science produces what we might think of as bits of discourse, these bits of discourse are strictly factual, never evaluative. So we need to ask what the criterion is for a bit of discourse to be merely factual." And then he goes on to suggest that the paradigmatic case here might be that electrons have negative charge, which is clearly seen as a factual statement. It makes no claim as to whether this is good or bad. It is, in essence, value neutral. However, Dupre argues that there is a blurring of boundaries between factual and descriptive statements and normative evaluative statements when the matters we are studying concern us directly as humans. So the examples he uses here are America is a violent country and Sam is a violent boy. We may, of course, be able to provide objective measures or statistics, for example, relative crime rates for different nation states or a psychological measure of violent behaviour in children, to support these statements, but we cannot escape the value judgment that violence is a bad thing. One could argue that these are scientific facts, that America is a violent country or Sam is a violent boy, that are being communicated by a responsible scientist, and they're based on evidence, and that the judgment about whether this is a good or bad thing is a separate or secondary concern. However, as Dupre points out, if you went down to your local daycare centre and told parents there, based on a psychological evaluation, that their little boy was violent, you would soon find out whether the phrase is seen as descriptive or evaluative. Similarly, the assertion that America is a violent country is of political consequence. In reality, then, these terms are used both evaluatively by ordinary folk and non-scientists, including, for example, politicians, and therefore the term is ambiguous, and science cannot escape this hybrid language of description and evaluation. By extension, we have to recognise that we cannot escape the value-laden context of our research. So I just want to explore this ambiguity and its implications in two ways, through two case studies relating to the study of religion, science, and rationality. First, I simply want to look at the way that evaluative language slips into the interpretation and framing of data analysis and dissemination. And the second is a less clear-cut analysis of the way that epistemic frames, sorry, I've just lost my place, the way that epistemic frames or contexts can impact on data collection. Okay, so the first one I want to use is actually a paper by Zuckerman, which is a oh, sorry, this was a quote from Dupre that I should have given you, but too late. A meta-analysis by Zuckerman on the relationship between IQ and religiosity. Now, this was a social psychology paper that was a meta-analysis of 63 studies of the relationship between religious belief and IQ undertaken from the 1920s onwards. Now, I just want to show you the kind of media response to this paper. So it's very clear here that this is European. Remember, I'm using this from a European perspective. It's very clear here that this kind of buys into narratives that religious people are less intelligent than atheists. It's, if you look at the polling results at the bottom of, do you believe religious people are less intelligent than atheists? You've got here at the bottom, 74% saying yes. So this is a narrative that exists in the public domain that is already being reinforced by the research. So I'm not trying to criticize this particular piece of research, and I don't want to focus on those criticisms. They're actually secondary to what I'm talking about today, and I'm sure that people elsewhere have pulled this work apart, and they were more expert in this field than I. So I simply want to use this piece of research as an example of the kind of fact-value distinction that needs to be addressed when we're thinking about disseminating research results. So, namely, I'm really looking at the blurring of descriptive and evaluative language, not in this media discourse, but in the research paper itself. And it's not even that this is a particularly extreme example. I've merely chosen it as it links into some of the media discourse work that we were doing as well. So this is the part of the discussion section of the paper, and you'll see there's a section that says, first, intelligent people are less likely to conform and thus are more likely to resist religious dogma. Second, intelligent people tend to adopt an analytical as opposed to intuitive style of thinking, which has been shown to undermine religious beliefs. And obviously this language has been discussed quite a lot today as well, which is coincidental to my point. Now, there is a mix here of both descriptive and evaluative language. As John Dupre infers, there is a kind of hybridity here in the way that people are talking about this. And this is very, very much contingent and contextual on our own kind of position within a secular Western academy. So it's linked into our own epistemic context. It's interesting that anecdotally, some of my colleagues across a number of disciplines sometimes can't see the evaluative language in this statement. For example, the term analytic carries a certain cultural cachet. So just as the equivalent of a philosophical parlor trick, I've switched it around. So if we were to rewrite this abstract from an alternative position and posit that this research had been conducted by, say, I don't know, the Pontifical Academy of Sciences over 90 years, I imagine the media response would have been far more skeptical. So just look at the language again. So we changed it around. So we've got atheists here rather than religious people. First, intelligent people are less likely to conform and are thus more likely to resist secular dogma. Second, intelligent people tend to adopt an analytical as opposed to intuitive style of thinking that has been shown to undermine atheistic beliefs. Several functions of levels of adherence to atheism. You see that there is a kind of way that the language, you can see the evaluative language more easily when you switch it around. Now, one of the things that is problematic here is that it's not necessarily this piece of research is itself not saying anything of value. It's just that the value-laden language helps us identify the underpinning assumptions or submerge contextual values embedded within this body of research. Reading the statements from reverse perspectives can make us feel rather uncomfortable. That is perhaps because in some sectors of society or the academy, we are more predisposed to accept that religious people are intrinsically less intelligent, and this is something that's also prevalent in the public space discourse as well. And whilst this data utilised may suggest certain things, it's a value-laden language in the discursive section that relates more clearly to the reporting. So, one of the things that I want to pull out of this into our second case study is how this relates to this assumption that there's such a thing as non-belief in a kind of physical or philosophical sense, in the sense that atheism is categorised not as a belief, but as an absence of belief. However, ultimately, atheism, in contradistinction to some of the things that we've been talking about, such as agnosticism, is actually a belief system or a statement of belief, not an empirical fact. Now, I say this as a card-carrying, lifelong atheist, and don't worry, Will, I have no dead bodies in my basement. There is also evidence here, an underlying implicit assumption that there is a link between non-belief and scientific thinking. A dichotomous treatment of science and religion, which buys into a particularly ahistorical narrative about science and social progress. This value-laden binary approach leads neatly into my next case study, which is talking about the way that we conflate notions of rational thinking and science and then put that in contradistinction with religious belief. And the most contentious here is obviously creationism. So this is what we're currently undertaking a rather large-scale project on called Science, Religion, Exploring the Spectrum. Now, this is actually a question that is based on one that's used by Gallup. It's been used in a couple of polls in the UK as well, so more recently in 2014 in the Public Attitudes Survey. One of the things you have to note is not much of this research has been done outside of the UK. We have very little, outside of the US, sorry. Outside of the US, we have very little idea of whether or not people endorse or accept creationist positions or are in fact anti-evolution. And we're one of the first projects beginning to build a larger scale database of research in this area. the problem in these questions is that you tend to get this kind of either-or categorization. So you have a kind of creationist anti-evolution option, a kind of theistic, deistic evolutionist option, and a kind of atheistic, materialistic evolution option. Now, this makes certain value-laden assumptions from the outset. Primarily, the value-laden assumption it's making is that to be anti-evolutionary, you have to be a creationist, and to be pro-evolution, you tend to be atheistic or materialistic. And this very much buys into the narratives of the new atheists, Richard Dawkins. I mean, it's a fundamental facet of that entire worldview. However, you see that it's also coming out in some of the, this is from Jeannie Scott's work at the National Centre for Science Education. You've got this kind of assumption of a kind of a process of movement between kind of strong fundamentalist religion positions and materialistic evolution. Now, this underpins every facet of the research in this field, which means that you're actually just further endorsing this view by through data collection. And the questions in the Gallup poll do exactly that, because it only gives certain options. Now, when you start to unpick this and move away, so switch your torch off and just make an assumption about, let's find out who's rejecting evolution and who's accepting evolutionary science, and take out the value judgments about religion, you end up with some really fascinating results. Now, we've literally got a large-scale nationally representative survey being undertaken in the UK and Canada as we speak. Unfortunately, I don't have the results of that. I do have, we've tested the measures in several ways. This is actually from one of our pilots with 789 respondents across the UK and Canada. So we asked the blunt measure, the one that is used by Gallup, and we've got fairly consistent results here. So we've got here, you've got 15% picking the kind of creationist option. That's in line with the Darwin Now poll done in the UK and the public attitudes towards science one, which get it around kind of between 16 and 19% across those two polls. So we know we're kind of on the money in terms of the way that people are responding to this. Now, if you then break this down by asking some fairly different questions, which remove the reference to a deity or a god, you get some really interesting results. So where you cross-reference this, remembering obviously this is only pilot data, you get some interesting things. So for example, 26% of the participants who believe that evolution occurs independently of a deity believe that evolutionary processes could not explain human consciousness. And 20% of those felt that animals evolve over time, but evolution cannot explain the origin of humans. Now, interestingly, it's not shown here, but very surprisingly, those who identify as non-religious, so they don't identify as religious or spiritual in the kind of demographic data, 26% of those agree with the statement that animals evolve over time, but evolution cannot explain the origin of humans, and 27.6% of them agreed with the statement, I believe evolutionary processes cannot explain the existence of human consciousness. So this is people who are non-religious, who are human exceptionalists when it comes to evolution. Okay, my time is up, so I will skip through the next bit. The key thing that I want to highlight here is that by taking out the value-laden judgments in the research, you find very, very different results. And actually what we're finding is that clearly adopting a creationist stance isn't always the primary or only driver in this instance for expressing concerns or doubts about evolutionary science's ability to function as an explanatory model when it comes to human evolution. So, in conclusion, what we need to do when we're undertaking research across any different cultures, and obviously here I've only spoken about work in the US, UK and Canada, but those, from the discussion from the previous session, those are distinctly different cultural settings, certainly in terms of thinking about religion and non-religion. We need to be cognizant not only of the value-laden language, but also interrogate the value-laden assumptions of our disciplines and of the hegemonic processes of which we are part. We need to recognize that no culture is monolithic or static over time, that cultural identities switch. They are multiple. They can behave in different ways depending on who's in the room, in essence. And we also need to draw in more multidisciplinary perspectives to help us understand these kind of multi-layered contexts. So at the moment, we're putting together work across 12 countries worldwide where we employ qualitative social science research, historical media discourse analysis, social psychology, and quantitative survey work, and a token philosopher. one of the things that then comes out of this is that we need to adopt a kind of meta-reflexive approach. And I mean this in a different sense to the Latourian sense. I mean this in a sense where we actually kind of move into unpicking some of the more paradigmatic assumptions within our fields. But I will stop there, and I'm sure there's plenty to discuss. So.
Thank you very much. Well, we have time for some discussion and questions, please.
Yeah, just an observation. I think that we need to be a little bit careful about not applying double standards in our construction of religious concepts and then in our analysis of them. Because on the one hand, I hear this sociological definition that's being advanced that says, oh, religion primarily serves as tribal marking, but then on the other hand saying, oh no, these weren't really religious behaviors because there wasn't some sufficient threshold of internalized knowledge to qualify it as religious behavior. You know, and I see it sort of similar to someone who might be very patriotic, but not necessarily be able to tell you much about what the Constitution says. But that doesn't necessarily negate the fact that, no, that patriotism really is motivating the behavior. And so I'm wondering just what your thoughts are about definitions that are focused on the tribal functions of religion versus the transcendent functions of religion, and the caution of not cherry picking when it's convenient for the PR of religion.
Do you want to?
Well, I'll just say quickly, I don't define it merely in terms of its tribal function. I just say that it is a tribal marker. I don't think it's merely a tribal marker. So, and I think a lot of people will say they're motivated by patriotism, but I see it. We'll just take white Americans in the U.S. White American males in the U.S. feel that they're an endangered species whose lives are being taken over by Muslims who want to impose Sharia law. I view it as a kind of tribalism. We can say it's patriotism, but to me it underscores, it's like this fear of our way of life. You know, Christians in America think they're persecuted. Franklin Graham thinks Christians are persecuted in America. That's his tribe. He can say that he's responding as a Christian there, but to me, there's something else going on there. Anyway, I myself do not reduce religion to a tribal marker, but I think it is a tribal marker, and I think appeals to religion or patriotism or nationalism or God and country often are hiding something much deeper underneath, threats to ourself, threats to our kin, or threats to our tribe.
So I have a sort of slightly different response to this question. I think it's true that, in a sense, it's neither true nor false that religion leads to violence, right? Because as you say, it depends on what one means by religion. Religion as tribal marker, or religion as set of theological propositions. In some ways, I think the thing I worry about more is, okay, well, what do we think it entails when we say something like religion entails violence, right? Do we think that it entails the proposition that these theological positions are false? Does it entail some normative behaviors such that we should ban all Muslims from arriving in the country? I think that's maybe the level at which we should apply our more critical analyses, rather than a kind of superficial sloganeering. Religion does not lead to violence, because the sloganeering is blunt, right? Like what isn't blunt is where the rubber hits the road normatively, in terms of how we behave.
I think you're entirely right. I would resist categorization at every available opportunity, but then I'm an epistemologist, so that's kind of my job. And that's what we've been trying to do in our research, is try and not put pre-framed categories onto the participants that we're looking at across the spectrum. So without being disrespectful to previous research that's been done on evolution and public perceptions of evolution, it has very much tended to focus the kind of site of resistance to evolution, in essence, within distinct faith communities geographically, whereas what we're doing is we're looking across the spectrum, and then we're finding that there's something else going on underneath this, which no one's ever studied, because we're asking atheists and agnostics and spiritual but not religious, and as well as Christians and Muslims and every other faith denomination that is available in the countries that we're researching, what they think about evolution. So there's obviously something else driving this, but no one's ever studied that. That goes for all of the disciplines we cover, including the historical research. So I think you're right. We do need to be very wary of the fluidity of the way that people's identities fluctuate across different kind of spaces. But I also think we need to be very, very wary of using terminology across research disciplines as well, because a lot of the time the conversations we've been having today about different things are because we're coming from different disciplinary perspectives. And even those disciplinary perspectives, between the UK and the US, the language is fundamentally different, even within the same discipline. Right? So we even have to moderate the way that we communicate our research with other academics in kind of Western secular academy settings as well. So,
if I may, I have a question to follow up on terminology in science, right? So, I've been doing this for long enough now that when I see headlines that say the word intelligence, I think of whisk, right? I don't think of the word clever. I don't think of the word skilled, and I'm really annoyed, as I mentioned last night very briefly, with the kind of trend in the 1980s, the Howard Gardner folk who want to use their intelligence for all kinds of nonsense.
What is whisk?
Whisk is the IQ battery, right? So I don't even think IQ, right? I think of a particular measure.
I knew that, but probably somebody didn't.
Yeah. So.
thank you for clarifying for me.
In some ways, I'm not so skeptical about whether or not we should. I agree with you that we should be careful when we do interdisciplinary research. This sort of makes me want to just never talk to reporters, right? Because now we have to explain all the words, right?
I get your point, and this is the thing. It's a problem when you're a researcher. You need to be very careful about how you're talking when you're talking in different settings. We have to recognise the difference between opinion and factual kind of communication of research, and we have to be more confident in recognising that we do have opinions of research, and they are socially and culturally constructed by the fact that we work within a research community as well as our other cultural identities, right? So I wouldn't say that we shouldn't do that. The media understand that. Most professional journalists understand that to a greater degree, I think, than academics do. So that the concern I have is that when we're kind of not being internalistically reflexive about ourselves, our institutional settings, our disciplinary norms and settings, how they intersect with other disciplines, et cetera, and then go into different cultural settings, we are projecting problems onto them. So the big one with evolution and creationism is that I recognise I'm sitting in the US now. There is an issue that concerns me, that there is a projection of US-style models of creationism onto publics in other global settings, right, by researchers, because the assumption is that those norms are the same, even in the UK, where, as we've been discussing today, to be non-religious in the UK is more a norm.
Yeah,
right.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Elston Baker. I appreciate you bringing some thickness, epistemological thickness to the conversation. I think that it goes halfway, and I think that there's another half that needs to be traveled. And that is because, in my experience, I've never lost an argument to myself, right? And I feel that one blind spot that I see is that there's only so much that I can know about my own blind spots. I need the other, an authentic other, to help me see some of those blind spots. I want to connect this to the earlier panel, the comment about new colonialism, because I see that problem in the way that religion is studied. Without allowing, as a scholar of post-colonialism, Chakraborty Spivak would say, can the subaltern speak? Why I say, can the religious believer speak, or can the theologian speak? Because religious traditions have this sophisticated traditions of understanding the belief system, what counts as such. And I see the equivalent of trying to understand subatomic particles, but without reference to that abstruse mathematics. And so that would tell me a lot about how people think about subatomic particles, but say nothing about subatomic particles themselves. And so I appreciate your bringing up the need to be self-critical, but I also think that there's the need to engage in authentic, genuine dialogue with the other.
I entirely concur with that perspective. In the research that we design, we build partnerships in every single country that we're working with. So this is why I'm partly so jet lagged, because I've been traveling around the world building these things. And kind of, we've got to recognise that there's got to be a reciprocal kind of form of dialogue between researchers across different contexts. So it's hard to do. It's expensive, it's time consuming, it's exhausting, and you're right, you do have to be kind of constantly self-critical of your perspectives, constantly open-minded. I think the core thing is that we just need to maybe be more humble in what we're doing. We need to recognise there are restrictions with every methodology. We need to recognise that there are restrictions with the amount that we can say. I think one of the problems that I'd even go further than this is obviously, I mean, yes, we do need to bring a kind of post-colonial kind of lens into the discourse in terms of thinking about the setting of the scholarly discourses that we're buying into. But we also need to be really, really wary of thinking that one researcher in X country represents that country, and that's another fallacy I think people fall into. It's like, okay, so we've gone and done this study in X country, and we worked with this person, but that person is part of an elite themselves. And depending on I mean, it's you need to get to grips with things like the higher educational setting, the institutional kind of structures, the hegemonic processes in each country, and critically analyse that within each country context as well. So it's fun. We never know what we're going to find, but hopefully it kind of scratches at the surface and shines a little more light into the dark.
Okay, Jordan.
Maybe I missed it, but I was wondering, I didn't hear anything mention. Sorry. It's good. Okay. I didn't hear any of you mention age or sex differences in your participants making any difference. And I was wondering if you felt you can dismiss that, or whether that is of some importance in the kinds of studies you all have been doing.
Well, I can take this from my perspective. I think that to turn that question around, I think what was really interesting in, say, Will's work earlier is kind of thinking about gender in the research we do. There are certain assumptions, certainly when it comes to kind of representation of atheism, new atheism and science, that are heavily gendered, that I don't think have been properly engaged with. And then obviously, as Will was pointing out, the discourses that we churn out as scholars then impact on the way that publics will identify themselves. So there's a feedback loop, right? So I think we need to look at ourselves first and then think about how we're collecting the data. We do have some kind of generational differences. I mean, at the moment we're still at the analysis stage, but I think there's, certainly speaking from a UK perspective, and I don't know if Miguel might want to say something about this in terms of belief and non-belief, I think there's kind of generational differences that perhaps relate to biographical journey, so that it's easier to be non-religious, for example, in the UK than it was, say, 50 years ago, that might have an impact. So
in a cross-cultural or just any kind of like correlational study, like, it would be totally insane not to measure age and gender, right? So this is also in part true if you run experiments, but experiments are hard to run. They take a lot of time, and you might collect data from like 100 participants in a single study, and so you've got a choice to make, right? You either collect quite a lot of data from people across the sort of age spectrum, and then analyze the different groups separately, or plug age into your analysis as a covariate. So there are a bunch of different sort of methodological options that you can take. But I think one of the problems is there is a kind of like Bayesian superstructure problem, which is that academic psychologists are expected to publish at least 3 papers a year, right? And so I think even if we think that age is important, so I'll take gender for granted. Everybody collects like 50-50. Even if you think that age is important, you have these 2 choices to make. Either you recognize the limitation of your study, publish it anyway, or you wait until you have like 1,000 participants from different age cohorts, right? And the incentive structures of science don't allow us to do the second. At least most of us were not tenured. Okay, so what do you do in that situation? Either we expect the revolution to occur tomorrow and a bunch of senior professors will be leaned against the wall and shot, or we don't make too much out of single studies, right? Which is kind of like the lesson of the last like since forever. You know, if you're a young researcher, we've always kind of known this. Paying attention to one study is totally insane. So don't do that. And like, this is also why I don't want to talk to the media, right? Like, the media should just leave us alone for at least 5 years. You know, like, why do we come up with press releases for single studies? That's totally insane, right? Because they should leave us alone for 5 years. We should replicate the finding. We should try and get like larger samples, more diverse samples, and then maybe talk to us. And even then, I might not talk to you.
I think.
Can I just say, I just want to say one thing about the gender. It's been widely studied in the religion and violence field. Women are vastly less likely to radicalize, and there is a certain age group it's attractive to, 16 to 35-year-old men. It's not just young men, but old men tend not to do it. There are certain ways. This gets back to your question. I spent a lot of time looking at ISIS recruitment videos, ISIS's game plan, and then ISIS has a glossy recruitment magazine that it has, and it's like the magazine's like a video game. It glamorizes violence, and that's appealing to certain young men. They like to play these video games where they kill lots of people, and if you look at the magazine there, it isn't like listening to Osama bin Laden drone on some speech on a tape that you pass around. It's more like, look, they put out 3,000 pieces of sort of media a year to recruit people, and they use social media, Twitter, or they just become friends and start talking to people. They take a year or a year and a half to recruit people, and they don't need many. We're all worried about how many there are. There may only be 30 to 50,000 members of ISIS. We don't know the exact number, but you don't need many to get America. On June 10, in cities across America, patriots are marching against Muslims and Sharia law. I think that's an awful thing, and ISIS likes that. But anyway, you can see what they're doing and what appeals to primarily youngish men. And it's highly appealing, and it appeals not at a level of intellect, but at a level of passion and feeling.
To add to that, I mean, certainly from a UK perspective, I think I do agree with you on one of it. I think that we do need to be wary of not recognising that young women can be radicalised as well. And certainly in terms of anti-Muslim hate crime in the UK, if you look at the reporting done by groups like Tell Mama, women tend to be subjected to a lot of that anti-Muslim hate crime because they have in most instances, in terms of the instances of hate crime, are wearing visual identity markers, i.e. hijab. So there's a process of disenfranchisement that's going on with both groups, and I do agree there are certain characteristics in terms of extreme violent radicalisation, but there's still radicalisation with other groups. We do have issues with young women going to Syria, for example. And I think the thing that's important to remember is that in terms of discrimination in the UK, there's not just kind of gender discrimination going on for these groups. There's kind of, with BME communities, you've got double kind of layers of discrimination. So it worries me if we just focus on kind of the impacts of Islamophobia on young male groups. We need to also recognise that this has a huge impact on young women's lives. So but you're right on one level. So.
Go ahead. Yeah. Oh.
Thank you so much. I wonder if we could talk about heroic violence. Mm-hmm. It's like all cultures, there's a certain heroism that's given to defending the community for use of violence, but then there's this kind of over-the-top violence, which I see the ISIS videos romanticizing and really upholding. Then there's another level when the community actually experiences an existential threat. What permits savagery to cross over the top? I mean, religion is often an inhibitor of violence, but it can also be that which gives you an apocalyptic mind. That's what R.J. Lifton used to talk about, that permits you an access to go over that top. It's a romantic image, too.
So I'll just say quickly, we forget that the 20th century happened. And what happened in the 20th century is not in the name of religion. Vastly more people were killed in wars where we saw heroic violence, in wars vastly more than all that have ever been done in the so-called name of religion. And maybe, but
there's Christian mythology that's underneath it. It's
there are, yeah, so it's how you define it, but it's not afterlife beliefs in a lot of those cases. It is commitment to what Scott Atran calls sacred values. There are sacred, and again, we have to expand what we mean by religion, or maybe not. I don't really know, but it's not appeal to high God that people are trying to get into a next life, and we forget how easy it is to motivate people, how easy it can be to motivate, again, probably especially young men, but probably anybody under certain existential circumstances with an existential threat to do almost anything for the good of their community. And Harvey Whitehouse has done really cool work on how that works. And what happens is that people will do anything for, if it's worked right and you can keep groups tight and you can emphasize certain values, people will do anything for their group, even lay down their lives for their group. And so I have a friend who was in Afghanistan. He's an attorney in town, and he got completely cynical about what the U.S. was doing in Afghanistan. But he said this: I would have done anything for my group. And so it's huger. The things that motivate us are considerably huger, but they are your group under existential threat. People will do heroic things, and we see it secular, we see it religious, we see it in all sorts of guises.
I'm looking at this as an outsider, and I will self-identify as an applied linguist. So I look at this very much from the standpoint of language, and as a journal editor on one of the major international journals in applied linguistics. So I very much applaud you encouraging us to look at underlying epistemological assumptions. And one of the underlying epistemological assumptions that seems to be pervading this entire discussion here is dichotomy between science and religion. And one might be disabused of that pretty quickly if one looked at just one single book I would recommend, is The Origin and Development of Scientific Facts by Ludwig Fleck, written in the 1930s. He was a researcher, Polish-German researcher, looking at knowledge construction in the medical field. And the enormous social discursive way in which knowledge is initially created on the basis of sort of folk assumptions. And we have lots of folk assumptions that are being traded here, if I can be that blunt. And those folk assumptions are then gradually, contextually within the group and within the environment as scientific development goes on, are fleshed out in certain ways. But never is it the case that these are not issues that are part of a discursive construction of reality within a group, rather than an individual cognitive undertaking that is disembodied, that is decontextualized, that isn't socially valued. So the dichotomy that keeps being traded here between facts and beliefs in and of itself needs to be looked at very seriously, and then needs to be looked at in terms of its discursive construction, because primarily, for better or for worse, and I would be very self-critical in that regard with regard to the role of language, its transmission very often is through language. When Actually, we should be looking, and then I am referring to your comment, we should be looking at practices. We should be looking at behaviors. We should be looking at activities where language plays a certain role, but it is not the only thing. And so when we talk about Atta, then spewing forth that, these are my Islamic beliefs, that's a public discursive behavior on his part, which is really something that is transmittable for him under those circumstances. It says nothing about belief systems. It says nothing about religion. And unless we find a way of interrogating and, as you say, critically looking at these things, we're likely to be barking up the wrong tree.
What is the name of the author?
Fleck, Ludwig Fleck, F-L-E-C-K. The original was written in German, but it was finally translated into English very, very late. And one of the most interesting issues with regard to knowledge construction and knowledge transmission is how it was subverted, if I may be that blunt, by one of the most famous writers in that area, namely Kuhn, who was very aware of that book, did not originally cite that when
I think that bringing Kuhn into this is a good route into kind of a more recent kind of analysis. In terms of the kind of notion of what I would refer to as undifferentiated terminology and knowledge construction, I think one of the most important things we have to remember, you're right, it is too often that people create this kind of dichotomous relationship between science and religion, and that is primarily what our research is focusing on. I think the point is, and in some of the more recent scholarship in science studies in particular, is that we need to recognize that we are all members of the public. Like we are publics to, I am a public to your work, and you're publics to my work, in essence, because we speak in very kind of small group language in our disciplines, but also because we have very narrow expertise because of this kind of specialization that happens in academia. So there's that kind of level that we're members of the public. But we are also subject to public discourse and the impacts of public discourse and the kind of the narratives that surround every facet of what we do. So in terms of the research we're doing, looking at kind of perceptions of science and religion, what we're finding is that actually those that are seeing a conflict between science and religion is vastly lower than those that think publics will have a problem with the relationship between science and religion. Now, the problem there, of course, is that we are part of that public, and therefore, as academics, we are also subject to that process of projection. So there's that facet as well. One of the things that you can think about is this happens in other areas of the sciences as well. It's not just to do with science and religion. So some of the work I've done previously is looking at kind of hegemonic processes and knowledge production and language relating to genetics and epigenetics, which is actually how I started working on Richard Dawkins. There's a great piece of work by a researcher called David Kirby at Manchester University in the UK that looks at how consensus and disputes can be solved in the sciences by advising on movies. Like by changing the public discourse, you actually gain consensus within your scientific community. So there are all sorts of processes that we need to look at. So it's that's what I mean by meta-reflexivity. So that's a good example of that. In terms of we need to look at the processes of knowledge production in which we are involved in order to critically engage with the assumptions we're making within our own research.
Coming back to your point, as a journal editor, I look at this pretty seriously. Namely the whole business of publication towards tenure, and the extent to which in most of the research areas that we're talking about here, it is journal publishing in highly refereed journals that is the privileged environment. That has its own set of framing understandings, many of which are not conducive to the very kinds of things that we actually need. And in our field, in applied linguistics, of course, the big screaming now is stop the cross-sectional studies that are completely separate and laboratory and experimental, which completely block out what is otherwise really the most interesting stuff, and do longitudinal studies. And longitudinal studies, of course, will immediately kill anybody that doesn't have tenure yet. So
Can I make a comment about, so if I were, I had 20 minutes, if I have a book where I talk about science and religion, and I think we don't have good definitions, we don't really know what they mean, we don't, so, but there's a really wide audience here. We have to talk with the folk, and you have to use folk language. That's our common something. You know the name of it. But here's the cool thing. I'll just be quick. And cognitive science of religion is in its infancy, and what people are figuring out is lots of assumptions people have made don't work. And so there are these really cool studies, and there are all these really cool results, and we think we really got somewhere. And now you came and you complicated all this, you know, and then people figure it out anyway. But you start with the folk and folk language, and then you figure out, oh, this doesn't really work, and we're not getting there. And this works this works in Iowa, but it doesn't work in India or something. And anyway, these things are good for that because people I'm not a researcher in this field, so I don't do this. I read what people do, and what they do is really hard. It's at the beginning stages, and we have to remember that. But still really cool to be part of. And I think we do understand a lot of things a lot better, but we got a long ways to go on it.
Thank you on that note. I'm worried that we're becoming more and more subversive as we become more hungry. I'm going to make an announcement about lunch. We have lunch served outside, and we have the poster session next door. And then we return at 3 o'clock to start again, and we have several excellent talks, including the keynote speaker. Thank you very much. Well done.